Hi everybody, welcome back to Lifting the Lamp. This video is going to cover another underlying issue to do with what kind of life we want to live as a spiritual person and the kinds of value judgments we might make about what's important in life. Specifically, I'm talking about the issue of individualism and altruism. One of the big questions in spirituality. Should we have compassion for other beings? How far should that compassion extend? Should we, for example, be so giving of ourselves that we completely sacrifice ourselves, are willing to completely surrender our own well-being for the sake of every other being? Or should we, on the other hand, on the other extreme, think only about ourselves, make ourselves an island, and not be concerned with the rest of the world at all, and be unconcerned with the suffering of others and only concentrate on our own path? That is the question that I'm going to tackle today. In my last series of videos, which I will link below, I spoke about desire and I spoke about indulgence and abstinence. And the dichotomy between indulgence and abstinence, whether we should indulge every desire or whether we should abstain from every desire, is typically seen as one of the key differences between the so-called left-hand path on the one hand and the so-called right-hand path on the other. Two broad spiritual traditions with very different approaches to what the ideal life for a spiritual practitioner is. And the other issue that is the biggest demarcator between these two paths of the left-hand path and the right-hand path is their attitude towards the individual and towards the rest of society. Whether only the individual matters and we therefore have an individualistic spirituality, or whether other beings matter as well and we have an altruistic spirituality, and indeed to what extent other beings matter relative to ourselves. So, as with the question of how we approach desire, the question of how altruistic we should be to be spiritual people has had a pretty one-sided answer in most societies for the last 2,000 years. It has been taken for granted that we should care for other people, for other beings. In fact, we should care so much for other beings that we should forget ourselves completely. And so that the more spiritual we are, the more willing we are to surrender our own personal well-being and our own personal agency so that other people can benefit from the things that we have. So we have this kind of extreme self-abnegation of the right-hand path, which is best exemplified in The Imitation of the Christ by Thomas A. Kempis. That is a book that really gives an articulation to this idea of absolute self-abnegation that's been promoted by the right-hand path for the last 1700 years or so. And that is, if somebody attacks you, if somebody steals from you, let them steal from you. If somebody accuses you, don't defend yourself. Be willing to always put yourself down, lay your life down, and never ever retaliate to anything bad that happens to you. Because that is the most righteous way of being, and that's what Jesus did for us. So that is the most spiritual way of being. So it's this idea that compassion means fully giving yourself to others and leaving nothing for yourself. And there are a lot of people who have lived by that, particularly when the church was in ascendancy throughout Europe in the Middle Ages. But certainly the serfs that were working the land, people in the family who weren't the head of the family. All of these people were expected to live only for the collective and not do what they wanted to do in life, but only what the rest of their community wanted them to do. And that the most righteous way of being was to humble themselves and do their duty without complaint, do what others expected of them without complaint. Because to act otherwise is to be haughty and to be prideful and to presume that the individual is important. And in the 20th century, the communist societies that arose also followed a similar kind of value system where only the collective was important and the individual is subsumed entirely to the will of the collective. So what we're really talking about when we talk about the individual versus every other individual and what the correct approach is to who is more important, we're really talking about how the good society should be structured. And so the best way to assess whether we should favour individualism or altruism, or perhaps a mixture of the two, is by having a look at how societies function or don't function when they are mostly altruistic, mostly collectivist on the one hand, or mostly individualist on the other hand. And the examples that I've given of medieval Europe and of communism illustrate what it's like when you have a collectivist system in place. And life under those societies was very miserable. There was nothing of individual civil liberties to be found, nothing of individual freedom or agency, which is indeed a human right. That was completely denied. And there was no room for questioning the status quo. And often what presented itself as a system that was for the benefit of all people was really just a system that worked in the benefit of a tiny layer of people at the top who believed they knew what was best for everybody else. So even in a supposedly collectivist system, it's not truly collectivist. There's always somebody at the top who's the one whose agenda is truly being pushed. But what about a society based around the primacy of the individual? We have an example of this in the form of today's English-speaking world. It is really in the Anglophonic countries that the idea of individual rights has been taken to its greatest extreme. And since the 1980s and continuing, the level of individualism in Western, particularly English-speaking countries has been taken to an utter extreme, to the extent where it's almost unusual, it's almost unheard of for government to acknowledge that there's any place at all for regulating business, for example, or thinking about what is in the best interests of the most vulnerable people, or giving enough money to make sure that there's enough social welfare or healthcare or education to look after other people. And once again, the society that has resulted from that extreme individualism that is characterized by particularly America is also a form of really miserable living where there's no support, there's no social solidarity, everyone's just out for themselves, everything's crumbling because nobody does anything that is going to fulfill some kind of social good. And so once again we have a society that is really lacking in something. that is dysfunctional because it is denying some fundamental part of the human experience. In this case, the fact that our survival depends on our ability to cooperate with one another and work together and chip in towards a common good. And if you consider altruism, you consider compassion, but you don't take it to the kind of ridiculous extremes that certain Christian denominations take it to, or that collectivist, communist type ideologies take it to, then there is merit in helping each other, in supporting one another. We don't have to pauperize ourselves. We don't have to bleed ourselves dry for the sake of other people in order to still be helpful and still acknowledge that if somebody needs our help and we're in a position to help them, then it's worth doing. And if everybody has that attitude, it's in everybody's best interest. And if we're talking about that kind of altruism, then I think that an altruistic society is very much superior to an individualistic society. In particular, if you look at the work of Jared Diamond, specifically in his book Collapse, there is a pattern that emerges throughout history where very advanced civilizations go through a sudden collapse. And there's often very similar kinds of trends in those societies which weaken them to the point where they then collapse in on themselves. And one of the major reasons why complex societies collapse is because the social contract breaks down, because there's no sense in the prevailing ideology of whoever the ruling class or the governing class is that it is worthwhile looking after the general population and maintaining their well-being. And so instead what you have is a situation where there's no social support for the majority of ordinary people. Everyone's poor, everyone's out for themselves, infrastructure is crumbling, and all of the wealth is being siphoned off to a very small number of elites at the top who have become debauched and overindulgent and decadent and have more than they could possibly ever need in their lifetime. And when that starts to happen, the society becomes more vulnerable. And when times of crisis approach, such as the inevitable economic crisis that must come from impoverishing the majority of the population, or some kind of social strife, which again is an inevitable outcome of completely disenfranchising and impoverishing the majority of the population, then that society breaks very easily. It breaks down very easily because there's no support, there's no social glue holding that society together. And if you combine that with an ecological catastrophe, then there's a very good chance that the society will not survive. And that should sound familiar. And hearing this should create a sense of urgency in people that if we allow our sense of compassion and care for other people to break down on a society-wide level, as indeed we have in the English-speaking world, and we don't do something to restore that if it is lost, then civilization itself can be at stake. And all the great religions of the world talk about how civilization goes through a cycle where it reaches a time of deterioration where people forget how to care for each other and everything seems to be falling apart, and the only way that humanity is saved in those periods is if righteous people do what they can to restore that law of cooperation, that sense of cooperation and common solidarity between people. And that is in many ways the task that is before us in these times. But again, I think there's problems with the way that The religions of the past 2,000 years have spoken about compassion and altruism, and I think we need a reframing of what true compassion is and what true altruism is in order to truly be able to set that up as a realistic ideal for a society again. Leave your comments down below, and please subscribe to this channel if you've enjoyed this content so you can be alerted as soon as my new videos are uploaded. Thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next time.